I am in the process of getting additional equipment set up so that we can play the music like this, and we can dance. We can dance if we want to. Hello and welcome to Let's Pod This. I'm so glad you're here. My name is Andy Moore, and I'm joined by my two esteemed co-hosts, Dr. Scott Nelson. Hello, sir. And the illustrious Bailey Perkins. Hello.
Hello, Andy. Hey, Scott.
Great to see you both. Happy Friday. Bailey, it has been a full year that you have been with us on the podcast.
It has, and I'm so grateful for this journey with you all and to be able to share insights about the political process to help make our civic engagement easier so that more people can be involved in their government. And we've interviewed some really esteemed guests to have their hot takes on different issues that have come about. And we've even gone through highs and lows together as a unit. So I even feel closer to both you, Andy, and Scott through this journey. So I'm grateful to be on the pod with y'all.
Well, and it's so crazy that, a year ago this week, we had, certainly there was news about a virus circulating in dark corners of Southeast Asia, but it hadn't made it here. I think it was in the U.S. by now, but it wasn't in Oklahoma yet. And honestly, a year ago, in just a couple of days, my daughter was born. And so it's crazy that she has reached a year now, or she will this weekend. And none of us knew what this last year would hold back then.
I mean, it's crazy because I remember us sitting and talking in studio, one of the last episodes that we did in person, and we were talking about the Diamond Princess and, the outbreak that had happened on the ship. And I remember before I had learned very much about COVID at all, I being pretty firmly in the camp of like, y'all, I don't think this is going to be a big deal. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I remember like it's going to, the mortality rate is so low, which by and large is true. The mortality rate is significantly higher than flu, but I don't think in the US anyway, had any idea of how many people get so severely ill with this disease and what it does to them. And it was not even 2 weeks later that we started hearing reports of what was coming out of northern Italy, in Milan specifically, and in the clothing, the area, the textile areas of Italy. And then shortly after that, it was New York and Seattle, and then New York. And then we were all just like, and then there was a Thunder game, and it was like, holy shit. It's been a whirlwind. I think, man, Bailey, it's been amazing having you here. I wish that we hadn't had to spend the bulk of our time over Zoom. I remember the first episode that you recorded with us. We all had some whiskey, and it was delightful. And it's just we can do it this way, but the pod is just better when we get to all be together. So I look forward to that day again.
I agree. I was actually at the studio today, starting to clear it out because our friends that let us use that space are moving out here in a few months. And I was like, oh, we got a whole bunch of stuff. And we just got new microphones just a few episodes before we had to stop using it. So I have one here. It's not plugged in yet, but I just like it being close to me. And hopefully by next week, I'll have it plugged in and I can use it. And then we can explore other options for how to make the pod feel a little bit more like in person, knowing that it will never feel that way until we truly are. Anywho, let's go on with the business of the week and the big news. I guess the big news of this week, it feels like it was forever ago, but on Monday, Governor Stitt delivered his third State of the State address.
And the legislature convened.
And they convened. And we are off to the races. It's already been quite a week for them. So let's talk about the State of the State address, what it is, what it was not, and then we can maybe wrap up with just general commentary on some of the other headlines we've seen this week.
Yeah, I had a really busy week in clinic this weekend. Didn't get to actually watch the State of the State. So I just kind of was reading through the transcript. And Oklahoma Watch, they do this every year. So listeners, check it out if you haven't before. They go through and do a really nice job of annotating the state of the state. With they fact check stuff, they offer commentary, they link to stories that they've done on the various issues that come up. But I'll tell you guys, I mean, if I just came out of my hole, pulled my head out of the sand, and read the state of the state, I mean, it sounds like things are pretty great, right? Like it's we're in great shape. We're leading the nation in virtually every area. We're doing better than anybody else economically. Like we've handled the pandemic better than anybody else. Schools should have been open again like 6 months ago. It's ridiculous that anybody's still doing virtual school. So the state of Oklahoma seems like we're cooking with gas, and we just need to throw some logs on the fire. At least that's what I took from the state of the state, and also in that the governor has done an amazing job in the last 12 months. That seemed to me to be what the gist was, but maybe I'm wrong.
One of the big things I do want to lift that will be a good thing, at least for a functioning government, is it seems like there's going to be more cohesion with the leadership of the House, the Senate, and the governor. He mentioned in the State of the State that they had already been meeting to work on different priorities. And last year, around this time, we were talking about the tension between the House, the Senate, and the executive branch, and actually not even the House and Senate. It was the legislature, because they were on one accord versus the governor. And so we've talked about on several podcast episodes how there was tension with the governor and all these different entities, and it seemed like from that State of the State that they're making a concerted effort to get on a better foot going into this session.
Yeah, I think that remains to be seen for a couple of reasons. One, we've discussed already that managed care is going to be a hot button issue. The governor has championed it pretty publicly, and he did during his speech.
And the legislature gave no claps at all.
That was an awkward silence.
Yes, it was. The whole speech had claps except that part.
Yeah, not even any courtesy claps. Like it was just.
This was when he brought up managed care?
Uh-huh.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It was a quick breeze through. He didn't give a lot of detail in the way that he was celebrating and championing the other parts, because I think he anticipated the tension in the room when he brought up managed care, especially from how it was handled, with the legislature feeling that the executive branch had an overreach of power and being able to just kind of unilaterally make this move.
And, as contrast to his first year in office, where the legislature gave him more authority, right? He had requested in his State of the State the ability to appoint agency heads, and they happily obliged. And I remember us talking on the show about how they were going to do this, but they may, if you ride the tiger, like sometimes you know what happens. And so you fall off, right? And sprain your ankle. No, you get eaten by the tiger and it comes back to bite you. And so once they did that, then year 2, they really pulled back on that. And he has not been met, friendlily by the governor, I think. And so now we're dealing with this situation where the governor is still seeking more authority and more power and just autonomy in some ways. And there are a number of bills that have been filed that basically redirect all authority through the legislature, like that the executive can't do these things. We got to pull it back.
And something that's interesting is that there's a nod to that actually, even at the very beginning. Do y'all know, without looking at the text, after the governor introduced himself and said, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Pro Tem, yada, yada, yada. It's a great honor to stand before you and to partner with you to lead our state through unprecedented times. Do you know what the very first thing he said was? The very first line of his speech. Says, I respect the constitutional authority of both of these legislative bodies. That is a weird way to start your speech, right?
Meaning him and the legislature, right? To say nothing about the third branch that was also present.
Well, I think he was saying, I respect Both the House and Senate. He was saying, "I respect the constitutional authority of both the House and the Senate." Which, like, saying that at your as the very first thing that you mentioned out the gate is kind of addressing that, like, a lot of people think that he in fact does not, right? Like, that's what to open up. So I felt like that was a really interesting way to start. So he says, I want to respect I do respect the constitutional authority. And he goes on to say that he wants to have the I pledge to work with you and have the best and most productive session in state history. And then his third line was the first reference to a top 10 state. Ching, right? Rim shot gif, right? And then he kind of moved into his first section where, to my mind, he mostly talked about how awesome he did at managing the pandemic.
Which is a pretty typical, and I think in many ways, like, his speech was somewhat formulaic for State of the State addresses, right? Much like the State of the Union, it's supposed to be kind of a rah-rah speech of like, we're strong, we're good, we're going to do even better. And then how they define its goodness and what's going to make it better is usually the part that people pay attention to.
Well, and I participated in a conversation with the Oklahoma Institute for Child Advocacy where they were talking about in their legislative learning lab, analyzing, what did we glean from the State of the State? And Daniel Billingsley with the Oklahoma Center for Nonprofits raised an incredible point that although he was, defending, the decisions that were being made over time with the timing of reopening the economy and, his push on getting kids back in school and the distribution of vaccines and all these things related to the pandemic, there was also this underlying boogeyman throughout. And so Dan made the argument that there was always something that was to blame. It was the radical left in Washington, D.C., or what was blaming Tulsa superintendent for not getting kids back in in-person education. It was blaming the state for not doing anything different around Medicaid to make costs go down. It was, blame or pit a criminal who's a member of a tribal nation on the McGirt case, right? So there was always an underlining place to fit blame instead of even tying together, right, how he's championing these things. It's we did this and this is not happening because they didn't do that. Here's what we're going to do. And especially on the context of, I felt some disjointedness on this idea at the very end about unity, but you overtly say the voters brought together a record number of Republican members, so we're going to carry out a conservative agenda, which overtly says we don't care about working across the aisle. Like, we have control. We're going to do the things that we want to do. And so that was an interesting partisan spin that we rarely get out of the State of the States so overtly from past governors.
Yeah. And what was also just funny to me about that, he was like, Oklahomans elected more, expanded the Republicans' majority in the legislature, which is true. But that doesn't tell the whole story, right? Like, part of the story is that many of them did not have a Democratic opponent at all. It doesn't talk about districts that were gerrymandered 10 years ago to ensure that they can maintain the majority. It does, it doesn't, just because they got elected doesn't accurately reflect the fact that it is the proportion of Republicans to Democrats in the legislature is vastly different than the proportion of Republicans to Democrats as far as registered voters go, right? So, and also, yeah, it just was like, why would you say that?
And also, it doesn't account for the fact that that record number of Republicans got elected in a year where there was record turnout on both sides of the aisle in an extremely polarized national electorate. And Oklahoma is one of the few remaining states that allows people to vote straight party, right? So I'm curious. I have no idea what's going to happen in 2022. I've given up trying to make predictions about things, but like, I'm we saw in the Georgia runoffs at the national senatorial level, that there was a little bit of a drop off, in turnout on, in some of the more conservative districts, in the runoff election compared to the presidential election. And I don't know if that'll happen in Oklahoma, but it does make me wonder: is if you have people that came out to vote in 2020 and they were coming out because they wanted to vote for Donald Trump for president, but they checked straight ticket Republican. That doesn't mean that there's going to be any seats that flip in 2022. But I think you can certainly posit that the reason there are more Republicans in the legislature than ever before is because Oklahomans are just super happy with the way the Republicans are running the state, and if they are, that's fine. But I don't think that you can say that that's like the only plausible explanation. It's probably part of it, but I don't know that it tells the entire story. It is just interesting to me, and you're right, Andy. I think that this is a very formulaic state of the state. Like there's nothing in it that was just super surprising, but it's just a little bit, as as a doctor who's taking care of COVID patients, who's taking care of COVID patients in the outpatient setting and in the inpatient setting, who's I've seen the pandemic like up close, and to just read through this section about like the amazing job that we did in Oklahoma and how other states all across the country are figuring out that we did it the right way and that we took the smart approach. And then you put that in contrast, right? Nothing about masking, and then you contrast that with like experiencing the pandemic all day every day, like in your face, and then you further contrast it with what we know, that like we were ignoring White House guidelines even from the Trump administration, the like reticence to provide those White House reports that were being made available to the state leadership, to not provide those to the public. It just was a little like, are you saying this because that's what you say in this speech? Are you saying it because this is really what you believe? Like, I just, it just, it was not surprising, but, but that notwithstanding, it was still just like a little bit surreal to read, like, if that makes any sense.
And I felt that there were a whole lot of missed opportunities throughout. So I'll just highlight a few that I've been thinking about, since I heard the state of the state. I felt like one, there was a missed opportunity to connect with the people of the state. There was an overt effort to make this about businesses in Oklahoma, making it business friendly in the top 10. There was nothing that spoke to the needs that people have and the families that may be facing eviction, the Oklahomans who are battling hunger and have never needed our services before, right? And so there was no connection to relate to the challenges people may be feeling, or even if they're a caregiver and they have a loved one with COVID and now that's affecting their work. But it was this very, Pollyanny kind of, things are going to be great. We're going to be a business state. We're going to attract more businesses, as if businesses are the only people who reside in the state of Oklahoma. And I think that was concerning. I think the other piece I was missing was the pulse on our social climate. He missed a real opportunity to speak to the racial tension that happened, the insurrection that happened in DC, the heightened frustration that Americans are feeling in this country. I mean, whether it's talking about, police brutality and violence, and the constant disappointments that Black Lives Matter advocates are feeling, and others, to Trump supporters feeling like they've been left behind or that their backs have been turned on because now they're having to face accountability for their actions, to, the people who are just kind of trying to figure out this time of of tension and division. And there was just nothing about that, as if we're living in this la la land and everything is great. I mean, he even tried to mention a Black business or two that received funding through a state program, but it was still very tone deaf. And there were some areas that were frankly overtly racist when he was talking about the like McGirt case. I don't think that did anything to further his relationships with tribal nations. And so that was definitely a missed opportunity. And then I'd say, to Scott's point, he missed an opportunity to have sensitivity for those who lost lives and are battling the coronavirus pandemic, right? The big focus was, look what we did, look how we approached this, and not saying, here's what we need to do to slow the spread. Here's what we need to do aggressively. And it was focused on how we get back so that businesses can thrive, and not how do we get back so fewer people have to suffer from this virus, right? So kind of tying back to that human element that I just felt like it wasn't a speech from a governor who is trying to represent 4 million people.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point, Bailey. And I mean, as listeners know, the loss of COVID hits me, in a very personal way, from my mom dying a couple of months ago from it. And I think you're right. Like, there was an element that of like empathy or humanity that was missing, that I feel like this year in particular would have been nice, right? Like, I get doing a rah-rah, go business, that kind of speech. But I feel like he said a couple of sentences that were like, these are the two phrases I will allocate towards humanity, right? Like, we've lost people, so sad, but we're open for business. And even in the section where he talked about,
and other states are behind us, but look what we did.
Yeah.
Now,
so
even California and New York are having to, and it's like that
right.
doesn't resonate with Oklahomans.
No, well, probably some, right? But like, Leader Virgin had in their response, like, she said that the governor, the way his speech was nothing more than revisionist history, was what her quote said. And I get her saying that, of course, certainly coming from the minority party. How I have viewed it, I think increasingly, as I've reflected on it over this week as we prepared to record today, is that his speech told one side of the story, which is true, right? Like, we did open up sooner than other states. We did have a better economic response, perhaps because of that. Like, it's still a little early to be known, for one thing, because it wasn't as bad here as quickly here as it was in like New York or California. And so their economies took a bigger hit, and our rates are still high, but it took a longer for our wave to get hit. And there's a lot of other factors that go into that. And as we saw in like 2008, 2009, that economic crisis didn't hit Oklahoma as hard for a couple of years until it like trickled down into our economy. And so I'm curious to see how it'll go. Tax returns, gross revenues have continued to decline. And so I suspect the worst may be yet to come. But his side of the story, I guess I'll say it, his side of the story left out, right? It didn't necessarily revise anything, but it certainly left out this other side, that yes, there have been 3,000 Oklahomans that have died from COVID, but there have been more than 500,000 that have had it, right? That have been diagnosed. And the current estimates are
3 people on this podcast.
Right. And the in addition to that, right, the best estimates are that we're only diagnosing 30 to 50% of all the cases that are out there. And so there's actually been, right, like perhaps as many as 1 million or, 1.5 million cases of people who have had it. And I have a friend today that's a nurse that was having to, she saw a picture on Twitter of school children, I think it's some school and more, and they would make cards for a nursing home, which is a very sweet thing. But all the photos, the kids didn't have masks on, including the kids in the background. And that was like kind of a gut punch to know that like you're not wearing masks, but you're sending cards to people who can't leave and are more susceptible. And then my friend that's the nurse said, I just referred a child to a cardiologist because they have heart damage from having COVID. Like, yes, they lived, but they have this ongoing health issue that very well may be with them for the rest of their life. And I think about that a lot of like what the next 10, 20 years are going to look like as children age, as athletes age, as well, we all age. That's the way time works, but that lots of ancillary health issues will just begin to manifest, and we'll see the impacts of COVID long after we all get vaccinated and get past the disease. And that is heartbreaking, right? And not, I mean, it's not a direct comparison, but like when we dropped the nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right? Like we killed, and Hiroshima, I think we killed 1 million people that night. And then, but the like radiation poisoning that affected millions more, that then had higher rates of cancer and birth defects, all this stuff that carried on for like 3 generations, right? And so just because you didn't die in the bomb doesn't mean that your life and the lives of everyone around you wasn't forever changed. Anyway, I don't know how you give that speech and it also be a rah business speech at the same time, but I would have liked to have seen a little more humanity and empathy from our chief executive.
Right. I mean, that's, and he goes on to talk about how at the end of the section that like our cases are down by X% and our hospitalizations are down by X%, as though that's happening because of all the great things that we're doing. And it's like, well, even if you watched one of the press conferences, I think it was from Healthy Oklahoma Coalition this week, where several of the docs were saying, yeah, cases are falling. And we think it's because when you take the fact that we do have some large percent of the population is wearing masks most of the time, right? It's not like there's nobody masking in Oklahoma, but you take that and then you put that into context with the fact that we've administered about 500,000 vaccines, but 500,000 people have gotten their first dose, which is good. I want to say that the vaccination effort in Oklahoma is going really well, both objectively and in comparison to how it's going other places. So that's good news. But we think a big part of why we're starting to see cases drop is because so many people have had COVID, right? Like if you think that the 500,000 people that we know have had COVID, if that's an undercount by 50% and 1 million people have had COVID, and then on top of that, you had 500,000 people have had the first dose of the shot, and then you add in the people that are masking and distancing. Like now we're probably starting to get towards what's called conditional herd immunity, which means that R is dropping below 1 and the virus just has fewer places to spread. That is unequivocally good news. But I think an open question, or at least something that, I don't know, we're going to have the answer today, but like, did we have to have 1 million people get COVID and 3,000 die for that to happen? Right? Like,
so Scott, you mean to tell me that it wasn't because we opened the economy and opened businesses back up in June?
It was not because of that, Bailey. I feel confident saying that it was not because of that decision.
Well, another piece that I want to lift, I mean, Andy, there was some explicitly revisionist history in the speech. The governor made a statement saying that we need to come together in the way that we did in 1907. And
Just like
to me, that emphasizes even further. There's a bill in the Senate side that would prevent schools from teaching about anything that would be like divisive or anything. This is the exact reason why that bill is dangerous, right? Because if we're telling kids that everything was great and, Native Americans and white people loved each other and hugged and they shared land to create this great state, like you're leaving out so much context that ties into why we have some of the social and economic challenges we have now, right? I mean, the first law on the books in Oklahoma was segregation.
right. Yeah, his speech was like,
yeah,
it was like the picture of the Pilgrims and the Indians like having dinner, right? That we all grew up with. Like that is explicitly not what happened, right? It wasn't like one big happy table where they're all carving the turkey and handing corn to each other. Like that is not remotely what happened.
Our state was founded on violence, and we cannot sugarcoat that in any kind of way, because otherwise we're literally lying to think that people were unified and they came together to create the state. No, lands were stolen to create the state. And then even the lands that were given to tribal nations are still like under question of the extent of their sovereignty, right? Even
Well,
today.
and yeah, and that part of the speech really like it made me feel uncomfortable. Like if I'm being honest, it was that like kind of like piece where he was talking about the McGirt ruling because the examples were like, they let this rapist go and they may not even pay taxes. And I was like, what year is it, man? Like these are they are Oklahomans. They are our friends and neighbors. You, sir, are a tribal member. Like, and I
And
just
it's
was
not
like,
even about the case, but
no, I was wondering
necessarily
if he was going to use the word savages at some point. Like it was really bad.
right. It has nothing to do necessarily with that case, but more so about jurisdiction and where power resides. And so for him to even use that in the way that he did was irresponsible and frankly racist. I mean, it's February 1st was the first day of Black History Month, and we've reached the 100th anniversary of the massacre that took place in 1921 in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in North Tulsa, a thriving community of Black folks who owned all kinds of things. The dollar passed several times in the community before it went out. I mean, Black folks in North Tulsa were thriving, and then their community was literally burned down by even like the government participated, right? Because you had like National Guardsmen and police officers that helped literally burn down the community and kill people. And to this day, they've received a put a plaque here and my bad, y'all. Like there hasn't been real reparation for that. And at the very, very, very least, just making mention and acknowledging that that moment is a terrible part of our history, but it is a part of our history is it's irresponsible. So even just like our eyes, my eyes, I can't speak for everybody else, but like my eyes were like, what? When I heard let's come together like we did in 1907.
Yeah, it was there were several things like that that just kind of stood out and I think were a gut punch to a lot of Oklahomans, right? Regardless of party affiliation, like sometimes just, based on race and ethnicity. And so it was a weird thing. So let's also talk a little bit about his comments about education because they garnered quite the flame war on the internet later. So basically, he said all kids should be back in school. I will start this by saying he did say one phrase that is well taken, particularly by me. That he said, "Can you imagine being a first grader trying to learn how to read over Zoom?" And I can because I have a first grader who has learned to read. Now she has learned to read because of her mother and because of me. And her teacher has helped a little bit, but they've only been in school. My kids go AB schedule in Edmond, and so they've only been in school for 38 days this year, right?
But
And
Andy, there were kids learning how to read, listening to the radio 100 years ago
well, and
when we
also
had
didn't
a pandemic of this
right.
nature
That's right.
generations ago.
Right.
So
Yeah, and this is way better. And also, it strikes me as odd that like a year ago the governor was touting the benefits of Epic, right? And like which was virtual learning. And so now to be like virtual learning is not good enough. It's like, but it was good enough last year, right? Like, and now more kids are doing it, and now you want to poo poo on it. So like, huh.
and that was the limit to the conversation about education. It wasn't about educators. We know you are on the front lines doing your best, trying to teach our kids, learn new technologies, staying up late on helping on weekends. Because I know that, for example, my stepdaughter is going to need some extra support. So the teacher said we can work with her on Saturdays, right? So you have educators like in institutions that are trying their best to continue to serve kids, make sure that they're fed, because there's so many kids whose meal comes from school. None of that was in the speech. It was solely about an agenda to try to force schools to go back in person without any kind of conversation about, here are the resources that we're going to give you to make sure that you can get back to the classroom safely. Or teachers, we're going to make sure before you get to the classroom that you have the ability to get the vaccine, right? None of those things were discussed. It was just bullying schools to say, look at these schools that went back, even though one of the schools that he mentioned on the list, Broken Arrow, a day or two before the state of the state, had to immediately go back to virtual learning because they had a shortage of teachers because there were so many people who had either been exposed or had COVID, right? And so it was just very tone deaf to solely have a conversation about the needs of children and students and schools to just be about they need to be in 5 days a week.
I demand that all schools return to in-person learning as soon as possible. However, I refuse to do anything proactive to try and make that possible. Right? Right? He won't do any of the things that schools and health workers have asked for to make it possible. Right? He won't institute a mask mandate. Right? We opened up the bars and restaurants, I would argue, too early, right? Instead of sending our kids back to school, we made sure that we had businesses open, right? Rather than doing it the other way around. And it is true, I think, that data has shown that you can open schools, particularly schools for younger children, and not have as much risk for COVID spread as we previously thought. It doesn't mean that they don't get it. They do. It doesn't mean they don't get sick. They do. It doesn't mean that they can't get sick and have serious complications, because they do and they can. But it seems like it doesn't happen at quite as high a rate in younger, particularly like pre-K and elementary age kids, as it does in like junior high school kids and high schoolers. But it still does happen, right? And
it happened to me, right? Like I caught COVID from a 6-year-old. And then my sister and my nephew caught COVID from the 3-year-old who was playing with the 6-year-old, right? These things do happen.
They do. They absolutely do. And the facts are that the things the governor has done to try and slow the spread of COVID in the state, he has done like kicking and screaming and being dragged to it, not because he was trying to be proactive. That's what's frustrating. And speaking of, if anybody wants to you think that I am tough on Governor Stitt, and I am, and that's fine. Somebody need to go read Dr. Deborah Geist response to the state of the state, superintendent of Tulsa Public Schools, because the governor did spend a whole section of his speech specifically calling out Tulsa Public Schools for the way that they've handled COVID. And Dr. Is it Geist? I always say Geist. Is it Gist? Gist. Well, Dr. Gist was not having it. And so if you have not read her response to the state of the state, you should.
I don't think I've ever heard a state of the state where a governor overtly attacked a person or an entity in the way that it was evidenced of him coming for Dr. Gist and the decisions made by a local entity. So we always talk about local control and the necessity for, local governments to make their own decisions. But in the cases of schools making the decisions based on the information that they have and what's best for their communities, it's suddenly not a good idea to have local control. I just don't get it.
Well, and it's starting to feel personal, right? Like his thing of just like Tulsa Public Schools, Tulsa Public Schools, Tulsa Public Schools. And he always highlights, Broken Arrow and Jinx, they've been open. And it's like ironic because they had to close either right before or right after his speech because of COVID outbreaks in those schools. And so it's like, that there's a risk with that.
BA specifically has the worst COVID outbreak anywhere in the state. Like,
Yeah. So all in all, it was
good speech. Good speech.
Good speech.
Good speech. Strong mark.
So we covered McGirt, we covered schools, we covered the businesses, a whole bunch, all that stuff. That was
Well, I said, Andy, don't forget about the people's agenda.
okay. Yeah. So back when he was talking kind of early in the speech about how more than 80% of the legislature is now led by conservative Oklahomans. And he says, we'll protect this, protect oil and gas from radical liberals in Washington, abortion things and business friendly and farmers, all the kind of buzzwords. And then he says, we are going to create not the House agenda, not the Senate agenda, but the people's agenda. And I was like, oh no, what is this going to be? Because
are we all gonna move to South America and live in a tent?
Is this a communism joke?
No, do you remember the people, Jim Jones, the people's suicide cult, the People's Temple?
Oh, right.
They all drank
Kool-Aid.
Yeah, they all drank cyanide Kool-Aid.
Yeah,
I was trying to make a no. Okay.
Like a cult joke. So, well, when he said people's agenda, I was like, okay, he's going for some kind of populist win here. But given how things have gone the last 6 months or 3 months in the country, it seemed like a risky move. So he says the number one priority or the number one pillar of the people's agenda, make Oklahoma a top 10 state for business. Number 2, deliver taxpayers more for their money. And number 3, invest in our fellow Oklahomans. And so I was like, I don't know what these things mean, right? Like, we still don't know what it means to be a top 10 state for business. How do you measure that? Deliver taxpayers more for their money? And I think that's code for don't raise taxes, but squeak out more services somehow.
He overtly said in the State of the State, we need more taxpayers, not taxes. So
obviously, Andy, it means we eliminate waste and inefficiency. So what it always is, and we know how much there is of that, right?
And give $2 billion to outside entities to run our Medicaid program.
Dun dun dun. Yeah, so he said that what we need is more taxpayers, not taxes, which I think is he's trying to say like we should attract more people here, but that they will pay taxes and thus we get more tax money. Like I know what he's trying to say, but it was just a weird way to say it. But then he said, and I texted Scott right then, I am proud to say that Oklahoma is open for business. I think next year we should make a bingo card of this, of like things, components of, I've done it in the past. And I think we should do it again of like things that the governor might say, or, aspects of a typical state of the state speech.
Well, and what's interesting is you said the people's agenda, it does make it sound like a populist agenda, but this whole make Oklahoma top 10 state for business, deliver taxpayers more for their money and invest, like those are super like that's I don't know, a dozen words or so that doesn't say actually anything. But to the extent that you try and extrapolate what that means, that's not a populist agenda, right? Like business friendly, like tax law and regulation, like that's not a populist agenda. Like delivering taxpayers more for their money, so trying to squeeze more government services out without any more funding, that's not a populist agenda. And investing in our fellow Oklahomans, I mean, I guess that could be depending on what you want to do, but like it just seems like they I don't know if they like poll tested some phrases and then took like 3 poll tested phrases and stuck them together and said the people's agenda. That's what we're doing. But like, it doesn't actually mean anything, right? Like,
well, even before that, there was a laundry list of we're going to fight for the sanctity of life. We're going to lower taxes. We're going to do this and that. Right before there was a discussion about the 3 pillars of the people's agenda. And so there's other elements to the people's agenda that are ideologically driven rather than driven by, populists or what the needs are for the moment. And I think that's the reason why we had, what was that, Wednesday? All the abortion bills were heard in committee.
Yeah.
So
I assume it was Rose Day at the Capitol because that's usually, and I think listeners probably know that, like that's usually the first or second day of session is all the abortion bills, all the abortion abolitionists go to the Capitol.
But it's not lost on me. But that was a priority mentioned in the state of the state as a specific bullet point. And so I think it's also an election season that we're going into. So we're going to hear more of the conservative rhetoric as we have a gubernatorial race. We'll have another congressional race. We'll have a U.S. Senate race in 2022. And so that's definitely just the beginning.
Yeah. So to that point, I was going to say, I felt like this was the governor laying out his platform for his reelection bid.
Oh, for sure. And his presidential bid after that, like for definitely. Yeah, I totally. Yeah, 100%. 100%. So it's been 45 minutes that we've spent shitting on the state of the state, which I think every second of it has been deserved. Was there anything we liked in the speech?
Well, like I mentioned, I think it was great that there's finally some effort to try to have better communication between the legislature and the executive branch. It's just not a good look for there to be so much tension between the branches and then to see so many vetoes happening because the governor may have one lens, the legislature has another one, but they're not coming together early enough. So even if it is performative or language, at least right now, it's at least being spoken that they have a goal of trying to work more cohesively. Because if you are the majority party that has a historic number of members in both chambers and you control the legislature, there's far much more that you should be able to get done. And so if they're not working cohesively, then that can't happen. And so I thought that was something that could be great for the legislature and even the governor as they move into a new election season.
Yeah, and I actually do like he talks a lot about the businesses that he's and other members of state leadership are reaching out to and encouraging them if they want to move to Oklahoma. I'm all for that, provided that we're not creating specific tax breaks and tax loopholes and incentives for all these businesses to come here if they want to come here because the general climate. I think that's great. I don't think we need a law for every single company that their specific tax break they get to entice them to come to Oklahoma. But yeah, man, the more we can do to diversify Oklahoma's economy, I think that's great. He talked about using the quick action closing fund as a way to help, provide cash to some of these companies as incentives to come here, or use that cash to create incentives for them to come here. People have been critical of that in the past. I've been critical of that in the past. As long as it doesn't become like a giant slush fund he can use for whatever he wants. I think one thing that will be interesting is, the legislature has to fund the quick action closing fund. And as the governor asked the legislature to do things that they don't really want to do, like move public health labs and privatize Medicaid and other things, does that create any leverage? Does the legislature say, like, if you keep pushing us on these things, we're going to hold hostage some of your other priorities? I don't know if they will, but they certainly can. They can do whatever the hell they want to. So, for me, the state of the state, it was mostly a lot of not really saying anything. And then the parts that did say something, I was kind of like, come on, like, let's get serious. But, I think you're right, Bailey. Having the different branches work together and accomplish more, hopefully that's good.
One thing I did fail to mention when we were talking about education, this is going to be the season for the school choice advocates, right? There were several mentions on the dollar needs to go where the kids go, and the governor mentioned the presence of ghost students because the way the formula is structured, it's based on a 3-year rolling average because students are constantly coming in and out of districts. And so they don't use, real time because somebody could move or things could happen or whatever. And so, but the formula is pretty standard. So it's not anything where schools are intentionally trying to game the system and saying, look how many kids we have, and then just kidding, because they already don't have enough money as it is, right? And so on the OICA chat, one of the former lawmakers brought up a great point that it sounds good theoretically to say, a kid's education shouldn't be determined by their zip code and that dollars should follow students. But when you get to the nitty gritty and start talking about school funding and how schools are funded by property tax dollars, are people in Broken Arrow willing to pay for kids from Tulsa to go to their school, right? Or are people in Oklahoma City willing to pay for their tax dollars going towards schools in Bethany, right? Or whatever the case is. But it's not as simple as, yeah, we'll just upend the funding formula and then just let kids go wherever they want. It's not that easy and simple. And so I think that's one thing that I know we're supposed to be talking about the positives, but that's one thing that was missing from this conversation is concrete budget proposals. Because that's something that we got from the previous governor, that this is how I want to see, state government funded. These are the priorities that I want to see. And it looks like one of the priorities is going to be figuring out how fewer dollars can be in the traditional public school system.
That's a very good point, Bailey. And like I have the speech pulled up on my screen, and so I'm reading the sentences that we talked about a minute ago, where he says, "We'll fight for our farmers and ranchers and the Oklahoma way of life. We'll enact business-friendly policies. We'll fight for the rights of the unborn children and stand up for personal." So all these things that are like platform things, but not policy things, right? And so I think that's a point well taken.
I do want to lift a positive action from the legislature this week. They are moving very fast to get the temporary provisions of Open Meetings Act changed and through to the governor's desk, so that way entities that are like nonprofits and government agencies and organizations and elected leaders, state employees can finally meet virtually and do things in a safe way.
Yeah, I mean,
so hopefully,
I sit on a state board and we haven't been able to meet for. I mean, we were meeting regularly until the Open Meeting Act exceptions expired, and then we haven't been able to meet since then because it's not safe. Now, this is a board that is composed largely of people that work in healthcare and child welfare, so we're all very sensitive to that, I think. Yeah, I think I'm hopeful that that's going to get done ASAP because there is work that needs to be done across the state that's not happening. Because right now, by law, the only way it can happen is in person.
And it seems like there's some energy from leadership on wanting to make some of those provisions permanent, particularly Senator or Pro Tem Treat. So I think that will be a good thing if they move from just, getting us through the pandemic to actually allowing state entities and government employees and nonprofits and others to be able to utilize the technologies that we have.
Yeah. This has been a big thing. So I'll put on my Freedom of Information Oklahoma hat, of course, that we've been talking to them about since the early days. I mean, since the pandemic first started, and working to get the policy to be, not too much, not too little, kind of the Goldilocks zone of open meeting policy there. And what we did last year with it, or what they did last year with it, was a learning experience for everybody. And so some of the tweaks that they're making now are very helpful, right? To like tighten up some of the loopholes that we didn't anticipate, but that people found, right? How they could use virtual meetings as a way to hide from, people, right? Constituents. They could say, oh, I'm going to just join virtually because they know it's a contentious vote, and then be like, here's a vote, meeting over, bloop, and just disconnect, and they don't have to look people in the eye when they do this. And
Or
so,
to one point that Eccles brought up that like there maybe folks who could say we're going to have a virtual meeting and then quickly shift to not be virtual, or they'll not put the meeting login and credentials. So it's like you listed it, but people really couldn't access it. So that's a great point, Andy.
yeah, and so there's a lot of provision. There's a number of bills, like 5 or 6 or 7 bills that deal with the Open Meetings Act this year. Some of which, Senator Treat and Leader Eccles kind of had mirror bills. A lot of them had differed about when they would expire. And I know from talking with Leader Eccles that changing or updating the Open Meeting Act is kind of a legacy issue for him. Something he'd been talking about doing before he leaves the legislature in a couple of years when he terms out. And so the advent of the pandemic gave him the chance to maybe tackle those issues sooner rather than later. All right, so as we wind down, we should probably at least briefly mention some of the other events this week and what's to come in the next few weeks. So we mentioned, Rose Day, and it, as usual, like the first few days of session were filled with discussion of abortion and a lot of committee hearings, right? So not much on substance, a lot of just early hearings. One thing that was about to happen but didn't fully happen was a report from the Legislative Office of Finance, Fiscal Transparency, whatever the LOFT thing is. So that's a legislative committee that looks at spending by the states, and they have a report about how the governor handled some of the CARES Act dollars. And I haven't read the whole thing, but at a first glance, it sounds like they are questioning that some of his expenses or things that he bought with CARES Act money might not fall into the strict definition that the federal government put out. Is that correct?
Yes. And Stormy Jones has a good, quick thread summarizing what exactly was brought up before Loft as violations with the expenditure of the CARES Act dollar. And so, well, not the expenditure per se, but how they allocated those funds. And so he says one of the findings was CareSford inconsistently provided substantive and necessary detail to policymakers about funding proposals or funding decisions, did not track or maintain methodology or explanation for rejected funding proposals. Another finding they had was a portion of the pandemic relief funds were used to fulfill longstanding agency needs. He gave an example of approximately 148 million being used through the OMES to advance funded IT projects. He said that several of them may be at risk for not meeting the federal standards of necessary expenses responding to the pandemic. And then there's several others that it's a good thread if you follow him on Twitter. But
yeah, I'll be interested to see because they're going to have that meeting hopefully next week. They didn't really say a date that is postponed to, so I'm interested to tune into that. But it, like a lot of things will be, I'm just curious to see how they talk about it because, as an example, the OESC, right? Like they desperately, I mean, they did need a new accounting system, but they didn't have the money for it, and it was just on the shelf as like one of those things we'd like to fund or that we need someday. But then this pandemic hit, and it went from like a need to a crisis need, right? And so they had to do something because it was just devastating to families. And I think that's the kind of thing, right, that in my mind, that CARES Act money is for. It's for helping an agency meet the need right now. Now, if that need was already there, okay, but like the fact that it happened to occur now and was hastened by the pandemic is just coincidence, right? It's now there are other things like the pandemic center. Like, did we really need that? Is that it's not responding to the pandemic that's occurring right now? I know it's about preparing for one in the future, but also it's a lot of capital expenses that might not be necessary. And so I can see where that one might be viewed by the feds of like, what do you can't? Okay.
Well, and I think that's where the previous administration and Congress had a failure in not clarifying what specifically counts as pandemic relief, because I'm pretty sure Oklahoma is not going to be the only place in this period of determining what exactly is COVID, what isn't COVID, because Andy, you brought two great examples of things that truly are COVID related, even though it may not be coded as such by the federal government, but really did contribute to helping alleviate the challenges Oklahomans are facing during this time. And then there are things that by name only are COVID response, but may be justified in the way that, the requirements were written for states to receive this funding. And so I do hope that this new Congress and the administration can help clean that up, because I think it would be devastating to have to send, $200 million or whatever back to the federal government that we really could be using on critical needs.
Yeah, well, and also if we have to send back money that we already spent, like that's a bad recipe there for our state budget.
That's $200 million we could be using to privatize Medicaid, y'all. Like, so that's,
I feel like we're starting to laugh again on the podcast, which I miss. It used to be a hoot every week.
I don't know what you're laughing at. That wasn't funny. That wasn't a joke.
Well, as we all laugh and cry into our beers.
The only other thing I was going to say is there was a little bit of fireworks this week. Senate Floor Leader Senator Kim David had some impolite words that she said in a press conference, impugning the competence of a couple of her fellow legislators. That was not well taken, and she was censured this week, which is weird and not actually something that's in the Senate rules, but it happened anyway.
And censored for just one.
Yeah, just for a week. Yeah, so she was removed from her privileges of floor leader for a week and censored for a week. So very, very severe punishment that she faced. But it's like when my parents would ground me for a week for eating too many candy bars, or I don't know, whatever I would get grounded for a week for. But
I think that gives us a taste that when it comes to the issue of Medicaid expansion and Medicaid managed care, it's going to be very tense, even among people of the same party this session. That's where the big tension is going to be within the climate of the Republican-controlled legislature.
100%. And the only thing I was going to say before we get out of here, I think, Andy, you're about to start us on our wrap-up. I was going to take a point of personal privilege and say, y'all, the great Christopher Plummer has died today. For those of you who don't know, you should. Christopher Plummer played Captain Von Trapp in the movie The Sound of Music, as the role for which he is most famous. But he had a long and glorious career on both stage and film, and I enjoy him in The Sound of Music, but I enjoy him in other things he's done as well. I think he's really funny and a talented guy. So R.I.P. Christopher Plummer, who died today at his home at the age of 91. We should all be so lucky.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks for being here. Bailey, thanks for being here as well. Listeners, thank you for being here as well. Next week, we will be joined by a special guest, Ellie Page, who is a senior legal advisor for the International Center for Nonprofit Law. And we're going to talk about a number of bills that have been proposed this session dealing with anti-protest bills, basically. So certainly these are some of those bills that were likely filed in response to, the events of the last year, right? So everything from race-related protests back in the spring to the insurrection at the Capitol in January. And I would wager that these have a role in Oklahoma that extend beyond that also pertain to things like teacher walkouts and really any time people gather at the Capitol. And if you read some of these bills, it's legitimately concerning. And so we're going to have someone, not from Oklahoma, a nationwide expert on this, join us to talk about these bills and why they are concerned about them here, as well as similar bills in other states. So tune in next week for that. And until then, remember that decisions are made by those who show up. And have a great week.